The judge ordered me to take off my Navy cross, right there in the middle of my own company's courtroom battle. The heavy scent of lemon oil and polished mahogany pressed into my lungs as the gavel came down. Kendra sat across the aisle at the plaintiff's table and offered a sad, perfectly rehearsed sigh. Her attorney had filed a pre-trial motion in limine to ban military symbols, arguing my service record would unfairly sway the jury. My lawyer, Miriam, had objected firmly, reminding the court that I had just come from a memorial service. The judge issued a narrow pre-trial order, ruling I could bring the miniature medal inside but had to remove it before the jury heard testimony to keep them neutral. I reached up to my lapel, my fingers tracing the cold metal edge of the cross one last time, and unpinned it. The faint click of the velvet box snapping shut echoed through the quiet room. Kendra leaned across the aisle and dropped her voice to a whisper only I could hear. "Finally, they see who you really are," she said. Moments later, my husband's sister swore under oath that I had signed a document giving her complete control of Harbor Shield Marine Systems. She presented the original paper to the clerk with a reluctant smile. I stared at the exhibit. The staple holes were crooked, and the top right corner was bent in a way that absolutely did not match the scanned version I had spent months analyzing in the investigation file. Miriam stood up immediately and asked for a bench conference. She informed the judge that this specific piece of paper was subject to a federal preservation instruction. The judge frowned, ordered the jury to wait out in the hallway, and called a short recess while commanding everyone to step away from the clerk's desk. When the session resumed, Miriam formally requested permission to connect a federal prosecutor on speakerphone. The judge waved a hand, clearly annoyed but bound by procedure. Following Miriam's quiet instruction, I pulled my phone from my purse, dialed a secure number, and placed the device next to the microphone. Malcolm Price answered, introduced himself, and demanded that the clerk seal the exhibit. The arrogant smirk on the judge's face vanished instantly. 6 months earlier, I thought the hardest challenge of my 38th year would be learning to walk without a cane after a major surgery. I had spent 7 years building Harbor Shield from a struggling boatyard into a prime defense contractor. 2 weeks of medical leave felt like an eternity, so I decided to return to work early. I parked my car, walked into the main lobby, and froze. A massive photo of me in my Navy dress uniform now covered the reception wall, completely overshadowing our actual company logo. I swiped my access card at the security doors. The card reader flashed red, denying me entry to the building I owned. A new receptionist stared at me from her desk, then glanced up at the giant photo, her eyes widening in recognition. Before I could ask for a temporary badge, Kendra rushed out from the executive suite. My husband's sister threw her arms around me in front of the entire front office staff. She whispered in my ear that I looked terrible and desperately needed to go rest. I pulled away and looked past her shoulder toward the digital operations board. The screen updated, listing Kendra as the chief executive approver. I retreated to the break room to catch my breath. Owen, our lead floor manager, slipped in and locked the door behind him. He refused to look me in the eye as he pushed a printed ledger across the table. It showed an $842,000 transfer to a vendor called Tidewell. He tapped the authorization line. The digital signature hovering above the approval line was definitively mine. However, the timestamp proved the authorization was sent at the exact moment I was lying on an operating table, completely sedated. Someone had signed my name while I was unconscious, and the only people with access were my husband and his sister. Dinner at Raymond's house tasted like ashes. Kendra sat at the head of the dining table, swirling her wine glass and boasting about the 3 massive contracts she had saved during my recovery. The roast beef sat untouched on my plate. I waited for her to finish her victory speech before asking a very simple question. I wanted to know why the security server required a new authentication code for my administrative account. My husband Caleb dropped his fork against the porcelain. He reached over, patted my hand, and told me not to turn a welcome home dinner into an interrogation. Across the table, Raymond stared intensely at his water glass. The patriarch of the family absolutely refused to meet my eyes. I left the table, drove straight to our home office, and pulled my original delegation of authority from the locked filing cabinet. The terms were printed in plain English. Kendra had a strict 90-day window to approve payroll and maintain existing vendors. The document explicitly forbade signing new contracts or changing equity structures. I laid the paper on Caleb's desk when he finally came home. He glanced at it, loosened his tie, and said the family had decided to extend the agreement for my own good. I asked him exactly how a family vote could override a 60% shareholder. Caleb walked out of the room without answering. The next morning at Harbor Shield, the entire floor staff treated me like a fragile glass ornament. People spoke to me in slow, soothing voices. I found out why when I checked a forwarded message from the server admin. Kendra had blasted a company-wide email warning everyone about my severe post-surgical confusion. She instructed them to forward all my requests directly to her desk. My chest tightened. I did not storm into her office or scream. Instead, I opened a fresh notebook, wrote down the time of the email, and logged the names of every recipient. Owen caught me in the parking lot at noon. Our lead floor manager leaned against my car door, looking exhausted. He admitted Kendra had threatened to fire anyone who sent me financial reports. Every invoice from Tidewell was being fast-tracked, bypassing the standard review process. I could not ask him to risk his job by handing over stolen files. I just asked him to lock down the system audit logs so no one could delete the digital footprints. I needed to understand how deep the rot went, so I tracked Raymond down in the old machining warehouse. I held up a printed copy of the first 2 Tidewell vendor agreements. His signature sat right next to Kendra's approval stamp. Raymond wiped his grease-stained hands on a rag and stiffened his posture. He reminded me that he had built this yard from nothing and told me I needed to take another 6 months of medical leave. He wanted to handle things internally. His cowardice gave them the time they needed to build their trap. By 3 o'clock, my keycard no longer worked on the executive conference room door. I stood in the hallway, looking through the soundproof glass. Kendra sat in my chair, projecting a new government bid onto the screen. The presentation slide clearly listed me as the active, directing manager of the company. She was using my veteran status to secure federal money while physically locking me out of the room. I drove home in silence, planning to call Miriam the next morning to force an audit. But a stranger was waiting on my front porch. He asked for my name, handed me a thick manila envelope, and walked away. Inside was an emergency injunction and a lawsuit filed by my own husband, my sister-in-law, and my father-in-law. They were accusing me of corporate sabotage, embezzlement, and severe mental incompetence. A hearing was scheduled in exactly 48 hours. My family had already built a case to bury me under the truth. Miriam sat across from me, her pen hovering over a yellow legal pad. She broke the emergency lawsuit down into 3 simple targets. We needed to prove who owned the shares, who held the temporary authority, and who controlled the evidence. The injunction requested by my family aimed to freeze my access to Harbor Shield completely. My attorney strictly forbade me from logging into the servers or downloading anything else on my own. We had to play by the rules, even if my family was busy burning the rulebook. She slid a sworn affidavit across the desk. My husband had signed his name to a carefully constructed lie. Caleb claimed I had returned from surgery deeply confused, mixing up calendar dates and flying into paranoid rages simply because the company was functioning fine without me. He took 3 real, mundane events and twisted them into a portrait of a volatile, unstable veteran. Seeing his signature at the bottom of that page hurt far worse than the surgical incision healing on my leg. The temporary order hearing felt like a public execution. Kendra sat quietly at the plaintiff table while her attorney projected a recent photograph of me walking with a cane. The lawyer read off my prescription pain medications, arguing that my judgment was chemically compromised. Miriam immediately fired back, pointing out to the court that absolutely 0 medical evaluations declared me unfit to work. The judge ultimately compromised. He restricted my ability to make unilateral financial transactions or access internal corporate systems, but he firmly refused to strip my ownership shares. Kendra wasted no time spinning the judge's caution as a total victory. By that afternoon, she sent a company-wide update celebrating that the court had stepped in to protect Harbor Shield. My portrait in the main lobby was quietly taken down. A local business blog posted a brief article about a decorated Navy Cross recipient being sued by her own family for erratic mismanagement. Miriam strongly warned me against posting any public rebuttals or contacting employees. Silence felt exactly like drowning, but I kept my mouth shut. A lifeline arrived 2 days later in the form of a blocked phone call. Tasha, our former contract manager, asked to meet at a diner on the edge of town. She looked nervously at the door before admitting Kendra had fired her. Tasha had flatly refused to sign 3 distinct vendor approvals because the supporting financial documents were missing. She handed me a folded paper napkin. Written on it were specific dates, contract numbers, and the names of everyone present when she was terminated. That napkin gave Miriam exactly what she needed to target her formal discovery requests. The first batch of court-ordered files arrived late Tuesday night. Miriam and I sat in her conference room, comparing the new vendor authorizations side by side. Something caught my eye on the massive Tidewell certification. The signature was definitely mine, but the ink baseline and the tail of the final letter were completely identical on every single page. No human writes exactly the same way multiple times in a row. We pulled the digital audit certificate attached to the document. The metadata pointed directly to Kendra's administrative account. More importantly, the timestamp matched the exact hour I was under general anesthesia. Someone did not copy my handwriting. Someone copied me. Special Agent Lena Ortiz did not offer me a cup of coffee. The investigator sat across a steel table in the federal building, sliding my hospital records and the 90-day delegation letter into a neat pile. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the documents. Ortiz wanted to know exactly when I discovered the fake vendor approvals and how much money had landed in my personal accounts. I laid out the timeline piece by piece. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the metal surface, and instructed me to completely stop signing any new certifications for Harbor Shield. The federal agent made no promises of a clean victory. If we moved forward, she warned, the government could suspend the company from federal bidding entirely. We might have to pay back millions in restitution, regardless of whether I orchestrated the fraud or simply failed to catch it. I listened to the quiet hum of the air conditioner, calculating the cost of doing the right thing. Then I picked up a pen, signed the formal cooperation agreement, and voluntarily froze my entire share of the company profits. Later that evening, my husband and his father showed up at my front door with a settlement offer. Raymond stood on my porch, shifting his weight nervously from side to side, while Caleb handed me a polished legal folder. They wanted me to sell my 60% equity for a fraction of its actual worth. In exchange, I would receive a generous honorary salary and serve as the decorated veteran ambassador for public events. The paperwork guaranteed absolutely zero operational control. I looked directly at Caleb and asked if he knew Kendra was copying my signature while the surgeons were cutting into my leg. My husband looked away, finding the porch light suddenly fascinating. The next morning, I sat in Miriam's office with Agent Ortiz listening through a secure line and made a controlled phone call to Kendra. I forced my voice to sound defeated, pretending to seriously consider their buyout offer. The current chief operating officer took the bait instantly. Her tone dripped with practiced sympathy as she explained that nobody actually needed me to run the day-to-day operations. She clearly stated that the company only needed my name on the ownership paperwork to keep the disabled veterans' set-aside contracts flowing. Caleb came back to the house alone that night to collect my answer. I cornered him in the kitchen, demanding to know how Kendra bypassed the dual-factor authentication on the banking portal. He rubbed the back of his neck, insisting he had merely transferred the security codes to her phone so I would not be disturbed in the recovery ward. When I asked why he never transferred the access back after the 90 days expired, silence stretched between us. He had handed his sister the keys to my life and just walked away. Agent Ortiz reviewed the audio file of the controlled call the following afternoon. The recording perfectly captured Kendra, admitting she only wanted my military status, providing concrete proof of her motive to freeze me out. But it was not a complete confession. The federal agent closed her laptop and stated that we still needed to trace the missing funds to secure a conviction. We knew why my family needed to keep me around, but we still lacked the final piece of the puzzle. Now we prove what she bought with you. Miriam pulled the corporate registry for Tidewell Industrial Logistics on a Tuesday morning, and the facade crumbled immediately. The official business address belonged to a post office box sandwiched between a laundromat and a liquor store. 2 employees existed on paper, with absolutely zero physical warehouses or service trucks registered in the state. A man named Vincent Hale held the title of sole proprietor. Finding his connection to my sister-in-law took Miriam exactly 10 minutes. A series of social media photos showed Vincent and Kendra sharing a secluded booth at an upscale steakhouse, their hands intimately intertwined over a bottle of expensive wine. Meanwhile, the current chief operating officer went on the offensive. Harbor Shield held a mandatory staff meeting that same afternoon, and a loyal floor manager secretly recorded the audio for me. Kendra stood before the entire assembly of mechanics and engineers, playing the role of a desperate leader trying to save their jobs. She claimed my surgical recovery had triggered a paranoid breakdown, driving me to invite federal agents into our business. A massive projection of my Navy cross loomed on the wall directly behind her head. She used my own service record as a prop, twisting patriotism into a weapon to convince the staff I was destroying their livelihoods out of pure spite. My phone vibrated violently against the nightstand at midnight. Raymond begged me to unlock the back door of my house, his voice trembling through the speaker. The old man stood on my patio under the security light, clutching a battered leather ledger against his chest. Stepping into my kitchen, he dropped the heavy book onto the granite counter. It contained his handwritten, daily log of every single invoice processed through the machining floor. The worn pages clearly showed Tidewell authorization numbers awkwardly wedged between legitimate repair jobs, with the original dates heavily scribbled over in blue ink. He confessed that Kendra had explicitly ordered him to burn the book. He had refused, but his next admission felt like a physical blow. Raymond admitted he was the original whistleblower. Months before I even returned from medical leave, he had noticed the fake invoices and mailed anonymous copies to the Federal Defense Hotline. His package had triggered the government's preliminary inquiry. But the moment investigators started asking quiet questions around the shipyard, the family patriarch panicked, stopped responding to the tip line, and let his daughter take total control. My hands gripped the edge of the kitchen island. I asked the man I used to call father why he still signed a sworn affidavit declaring me dangerously incompetent, knowing full well his daughter was stealing federal funds. Raymond stared at his boots, muttering that he only wanted to handle the mess quietly, keeping it inside the family. I told him he had protected his family by feeding me to the wolves. Agent Ortiz followed the banking routing numbers the next day and summoned me to the federal building. The investigator laid out a devastating financial map. Tidewell had successfully funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into a lakefront cabin, a luxury boat, and Kendra's personal investment portfolios. Then Ortiz slid one final bank statement across the steel table, and my stomach dropped. A small, carefully calculated chunk of that stolen money had been deposited directly into the joint checking account I shared with Caleb. Ortiz tapped the highlighted deposit line with her pen. If we cannot prove who moved this, Kendra will say you were not her victim. She will say you were her partner. The joint checking account held exactly $42,000 of stolen federal money. A single transfer to pay my rent would legally transform me into a willing participant in the fraud. Miriam made the risks explicitly clear during our morning briefing. Staring at my banking app in the parking lot, I voluntarily froze my access to the entire account. Walking away from that financial safety net left me with almost nothing. A local pawn shop down the street offered me cash for my civilian watches, a pair of diamond earrings, and a vintage necklace. Placing those items on the scratched glass counter felt humiliating, but taking their worn bills felt a lot better than spending a single dime from Tidewell. Miriam called me back to her office later that afternoon. Our aggressive legal discovery requests had finally forced Harbor Shield to hand over an image copy of the old backup server. My attorney turned her massive monitor around so I could read a recovered text exchange. Caleb had downloaded my digital signature file from the secure corporate vault. My husband then forwarded the image directly to his sister. The attached message stated I would be under heavy anesthesia for at least 6 hours, instructing Kendra to do whatever needed to be done before I woke up. The man I married stood in our driveway that evening, holding a leather briefcase and looking completely exhausted. I showed him a printed copy of his text message. Caleb immediately raised his hands in defense, claiming the signature file was only meant for an emergency warranty extension on an old defense contract. The weak excuse crumbled the moment I asked why my name suddenly appeared on entirely new federal bids for a shell company. His shoulders slumped in defeat. My husband muttered that Kendra had assured him everything was standard operating procedure. Caleb had chosen to believe a comfortable lie instead of protecting the woman he swore to love. The backup server held far worse secrets than a single text message. Hidden inside a deleted administrative folder was a confidential slide deck prepared for an external acquisition firm. Kendra was actively pitching a complete sale of Harbor Shield. The projected multi-million-dollar valuation relied entirely on maintaining the disabled veteran certification until the ink dried. One specific slide outlined my future role in cold, calculated terms. The new corporate structure would retain me as a decorated veteran ambassador for exactly 2 years. After that transition period, my equity would dissolve entirely, and they would quietly terminate my employment. Kendra struck back the moment we formally submitted the server logs into evidence. Her lawyer filed a vicious new motion accusing me of leaking sensitive trade secrets to sabotage the potential buyout. To support the fabricated claim, his sister produced a fresh affidavit. Caleb had sworn under penalty of perjury that I had explicitly authorized them to use my signature while I was recovering in the hospital. Miriam paced across her office, warning me that we desperately needed to find the exact legal boundaries of the permission I supposedly gave. The answer waited in the deepest, forgotten partition of the recovered server. A deleted voice memo sat perfectly preserved in the digital trash bin. Miriam clicked play. Caleb's voice filled the quiet room, completely devoid of any guilt, hesitation, or regret. My husband told his sister they needed to isolate me entirely from the staff. He suggested making me believe the company was failing so I would feel desperate enough to sign the buyout papers before the Federal Certification Review Board arrived. The recording proved he had not just handed over the keys to my company. Caleb had helped design the cage. Once she signs, her medal is just advertising. Raymond sat across the conference table, staring at the floor. The family patriarch kept trying to soften his daughter's actions during our deposition prep. My father-in-law called the forgery an aggressive business strategy, shifting uncomfortably in his leather chair. I slid his battered ledger across the polished wood. I asked him if he would still call it ambition if Kendra was the one being destroyed. Raymond looked at his own handwritten ink for a long time. Finally, the old man agreed to testify under oath that the board meeting transferring my executive power never actually happened. Kendra's legal team produced their ultimate weapon later that afternoon. A scanned copy of corporate minutes arrived in our inbox, claiming I had voluntarily surrendered all operational control. Miriam's document expert found the digital file highly suspicious, but a scan was completely useless for a federal indictment. We desperately needed the physical paper to examine the staple holes, the printer source, and the microscopic watermarks. Malcolm Price called our secure line an hour later. The federal prosecutor confirmed a massive search warrant was fully prepped and waiting for a judge to sign. However, the trap would only snap shut if my sister-in-law presented the forged original document under oath in open court. Malcolm provided a dedicated phone number and a specific trigger phrase: "The original is in evidence." A courier knocked on my apartment door the next morning holding a thick envelope. Inside rested a formal ultimatum. Kendra demanded I sell my shares for pennies, drop the civil lawsuit, agree to a quiet divorce, and smile at corporate events as their pet veteran. Caleb had already signed the bottom line, throwing his full legal support behind his sister. Harbor Shield laid off 10 more floor mechanics by Friday afternoon. Watching good people carry cardboard boxes to their cars nearly broke my resolve. Sitting in my parked vehicle outside the shipyard, I called Miriam and begged to release the audio recording of the controlled call right then. My attorney warned me that exposing our hand too early would simply force the current chief operating officer to destroy the original forgery and pivot her legal strategy. Miriam told me to endure being called a traitor for one more week. The night before the trial, Agent Ortiz confirmed her federal team would only execute the warrant if that physical paper surfaced. Then Miriam called with a bitter procedural update. Kendra's attorney had successfully argued a narrow pretrial motion. I could bring my miniature Navy cross to the courthouse, but the moment the jury entered the room, the judge would force me to remove the medal to preserve the appearance of corporate neutrality. Miriam clearly outlined our exact countermeasure. If the fake document appeared, my lawyer would demand a bench conference, request a short recess, and ask the court for permission to use the speakerphone. I was only allowed to dial the federal number when the judge explicitly granted access. I laid my dark suit on the bed and placed the small velvet box on the nightstand. That tiny piece of metal represented the people I had saved, not a corporate brand. Tomorrow, my family would try to use a legal technicality to strip away my dignity in public. I turned off the lamp, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside my window. If she brings the original, the warrant moves. If she does not, you may lose the company. Kendra took the witness stand and painted a masterpiece of corporate sacrifice. My husband's sister looked directly at the jury, her voice catching perfectly as she described taking over Harbor Shield out of pure family duty. Caleb sat 2 rows back, studying the wooden floorboards. Then opposing counsel stood up and invoked their motion in limine. The defense lawyer requested the court enforce the ban on military symbols right as the jurors settled into their seats. Miriam immediately lodged an objection for the record. My attorney reminded the room that I had just attended a memorial service, asking the judge to clarify that removing the decoration had nothing to do with its inherent value. The magistrate offered a reluctant nod, but he ordered me to take off the miniature Navy cross to maintain strict neutrality, in a business dispute. Kendra smiled. I did not argue. Reaching up to my lapel, I unpinned the small metal cross, set it inside a velvet box on our table, and closed the lid. The defense moved to enter their final piece of evidence. A crisp sheet of paper passed from the lawyer's hand to the court clerk. Kendra raised her right hand, swearing under penalty of perjury that I had signed away my executive authority in front of her, Caleb, and Raymond. Across the room, my husband's father turned the color of old ash. The clerk marked the physical document as an official exhibit, and my breath hitched. The physical staple holes were crooked, sitting a full inch lower than the digital scan we had studied for months. Miriam shot out of her chair and requested an immediate bench conference. My attorney leaned over the heavy wooden barrier, informing the judge that this specific piece of paper fell under a strict federal preservation instruction. She formally requested the jury be excused, asking the court to leave the exhibit exactly where it sat and grant a 5-minute recess to contact an assigned federal prosecutor. The magistrate frowned, ordered the jurors into the hallway, and commanded all parties to step away from the evidence table. When the heavy doors clicked shut, the session resumed. Miriam asked for permission to establish a connection on the speakerphone so all instructions regarding the material evidence would enter the official record. The judge waved his hand in annoyed agreement. Following my lawyer's quiet nod, I unlocked my phone, dialed the secure number, and set the device beside the microphone. The line clicked. I spoke 6 words into the receiver. The original is in evidence. Malcolm Price answered, requesting to be placed on speaker. The federal prosecutor clearly stated his name and jurisdiction, his voice echoing through the empty courtroom. He informed the magistrate that the newly submitted exhibit constituted critical evidence in an active fraud investigation, falling squarely under the scope of an already approved search warrant. Malcolm respectfully requested the court keep the jury out, seal the document, and prohibit anyone from touching their electronic devices. The judge looked from the speakerphone to the paper Kendra had just sworn was real. Realization washed over the magistrate's face, draining the color from his cheeks, as Malcolm confirmed a team of agents was currently waiting in the corridor to execute the order. The heavy wooden doors swung open. 3 federal agents walked down the aisle, their movements calm and practiced. They presented the signed warrant to the bench, moving efficiently to seal Kendra's laptop and cell phone in clear plastic bags. My sister-in-law glared across the room, hissing that I was using the government to tear the family apart over petty jealousy. Caleb stood up from the gallery. My husband bypassed his sister entirely, walking straight toward the lead agent to ask for a meeting with the prosecution. Then he stopped beside my chair and leaned down to my ear. Kendra did not steal your signature, Caleb whispered. I gave it to her. Caleb sat across from the federal prosecutor in a sterile meeting room that smelled faintly of ammonia and stale coffee. The man I had married confessed everything, openly admitting he had handed over my digital signature and authentication codes to help execute the fraud. The government offered no blanket immunity for his sudden cooperation. Caleb had to surrender his personal laptop, agree to testify against his own sister, and formally plead guilty to federal charges. He looked at me across the cold metal table, his eyes silently pleading for a sliver of absolution, but I kept my face entirely blank and offered nothing. Kendra launched one final desperate attack the following week. Her defense attorney played a digital audio file during a formal deposition, projecting the sound across the quiet conference room. My own exhausted voice echoed from the speakers, instructing Kendra to use my name and explicitly stating I did not want to know every detail while I was under anesthesia. Spliced together, the recording made me sound like a willing accomplice who had given blanket permission to run the entire shadow operation. Miriam simply opened her laptop and loaded the unedited file recovered from the old shipyard backup server. The full recording painted a completely different reality. My complete sentence authorized my sister-in-law to use my name exclusively for existing warranty extensions, and I specifically forbade signing any new federal bids or creating fresh vendor accounts. The digital version history displayed on the monitor proved Kendra had maliciously cropped the audio exactly 3 days after filing the civil lawsuit against me. Raymond took the oath an hour later, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the federal inquiry. The family patriarch stared at his calloused hands, formally testifying that the corporate board meeting transferring my executive power never actually took place. He confessed under penalty of perjury that he had remained silent about the forged documents solely because he favored his daughter. When the old man finally glanced in my direction, searching for some quiet sign of forgiveness, I just gave a slow nod and looked away. Reclaiming my company came with a heavy, unavoidable cost. The civil judge dismissed the lawsuit and dropped the injunction, returning Harbor Shield to my control, but the federal suspension hammered our daily operations. Our shipyard lost its active bidding status, pending a massive corporate review. I sat in Miriam's office, picking up a heavy fountain pen, and signed the paperwork to pay full restitution for the stolen funds out of our remaining corporate accounts. We hired an independent compliance monitor, and I signed the legal documents completely removing my former family from the business. 4 months dragged by before the grand jury unsealed the federal indictments. Kendra, Vincent, and Caleb were all formally charged with varying degrees of conspiracy, wire fraud, and obstruction. Despite facing years in a federal penitentiary, the former chief operating officer stood on the courthouse steps and told reporters I had orchestrated the entire investigation out of pure jealousy over her business success. Then her defense attorney called Miriam with an unexpected proposal. Kendra offered to plead guilty and save the government the cost of a lengthy trial, but the deal came with one specific condition. She demanded that I write a formal letter to the court, asking the judge to reduce her prison time. She had spent a year trying to use my name. Now she wanted to use my mercy. The supervised settlement meeting took place in a windowless conference room at the federal courthouse. Kendra sat across from me, wearing a sharp gray suit, looking exactly as polished and arrogant as she had a year ago. My sister-in-law offered absolutely zero apologies for tearing our lives apart. Instead, she leaned over the scratch table and insisted that we had all benefited from the stolen federal money, claiming everyone constantly used my war hero story to get ahead anyway. The former executive laid out her final demand. She would officially plead guilty right now, saving the government and my company months of grueling trial preparations, but the deal came with a price. I had to write a formal letter to the judge, explicitly stating she had valiantly saved Harbor Shield during my medical leave. I stared at the woman who had copied my signature while surgeons repaired my leg, feeling nothing but quiet exhaustion. My answer was simple and final. I refused to ask the court for a lighter punishment, and I refused to demand a harsher one. My victim impact statement would only contain the unvarnished truth. I planned to stand before the magistrate and explain exactly how Kendra had fabricated my identity, shattered my marriage, cost honest mechanics their livelihoods, and deliberately exploited a government program designed to help wounded veterans. The sentencing hearing arrived 3 weeks later. The presiding judge looked down from the bench, officially designating Kendra as the primary mastermind of the operation. The court recognized her for personally profiting from the stolen funds, manufacturing fraudulent corporate records, and weaponizing a civil lawsuit to legitimize a forged document. The gavel finally came down. My former sister-in-law received 4 years and 6 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The government ordered full restitution, permanent federal debarment, and total asset forfeiture, immediately seizing her lakefront cabin, the luxury boat, and every dime in her investment accounts. The rest of the conspiracy fractured exactly as expected. Caleb received a 14-month sentence due to his early cooperation, completely losing his ownership shares and finalizing our divorce before he even reported to prison. Vincent Hale caught his own federal charge for operating the shell company. Meanwhile, Raymond quietly sold his remaining equity back to me, packed up his office, and walked away. The family patriarch lost his company, his legacy, and his place in my life forever. 14 months passed before the dust truly settled. Harbor Shield Marine Systems shrank significantly, but we rebuilt the foundation with an independent oversight board and a dedicated compliance officer. After paying back every cent of the fraudulent profits, we finally secured our first open market defense contract purely on the quality of our engineering, without relying on my disabled veteran priority status. Owen returned to manage the machining floor, and Tasha took over as our lead contract director. We finished renovating the main lobby on a quiet Friday afternoon. A junior receptionist stood near the empty reception wall, asking if we were going to hang the massive photo of my Navy Cross back up. I reached into my coat pocket, my fingers brushing the cold metal edge of the miniature lapel pin, and placed it permanently inside a dark velvet box. I refused to let my military service become a corporate advertisement ever again. Instead, we ordered a brushed steel plaque listing the names of the people who had protected the truth. Owen and Tasha anchored the top. Raymond even made the bottom of the list for his final act of honesty on the witness stand, though nobody called him a hero. The Navy Cross stayed in its box. My name did not. Sometimes the hardest battles you will ever fight do not happen on a foreign battlefield or inside a cold corporate boardroom. They happen right at your own dinner table. You spend years believing that marriage, shared history, and the word family guarantee loyalty. You trust that the people who stood beside you at your wedding, and the ones who promised to protect you during the hardest season of your life, would never use your vulnerability for their own financial gain. But this story reveals a harsh, undeniable reality. When the people you trust the most start viewing you as an asset rather than a human being, they will quietly dismantle your life just to keep their hands on your hard-earned achievements. The most critical lesson here is about establishing absolute boundaries and understanding the true weight of personal integrity. Honor is larger than the medal pinned to your suit jacket. A medal can recognize courage, but only your choices reveal whether you continue to live by it. And honor never requires you to make yourself smaller, just to preserve peace within a dishonest family. True honor requires the terrifying courage to look right at the people you love and hold them entirely accountable for their deceit. You absolutely do not owe your silence to anyone who tries to steal your voice. If a sister-in-law, a father-in-law, or even your own husband demands that you carry the legal and emotional consequences of their lies, they forfeit their claim to your loyalty. Family loyalty does not mean accepting punishment for crimes you did not commit. You must be willing to dismantle the image of a perfect family when that image is being maintained with your name, your silence, and your sacrifice. Walking away from the people you once loved is an agonizing choice, but sometimes it is the only way you can survive with your soul intact. Have you ever had to stop protecting a relative whose secrets were destroying your life? What finally gave you the strength to say enough? Share your story in the comments. Someone listening right now may be facing the same choice, and your words could remind them that they are not alone.